When German prisoners of war stepped off transport ships onto Canadian soil between 1940 and 1946, they braced themselves for the brutality they'd been warned about by Nazi propaganda. But what happened instead would shatter everything they believed about their enemies and ultimately change the course of thousands of lives. Over 35,000 German POWs were held in Canada during World War II, and the treatment they received was so unexpected, so contrary to what they'd been told, that many would later describe their time in Canadian camps as the most transformative period of their lives. The story of these prisoners reveals something profound about how humanity can emerge even in the darkest chapters of history. And it begins with young men like Franz von Wara, who escaped from a Canadian camp in 1941, expecting to find a hostile population, only to discover that Canadian civilians were more likely to offer him food than turn him in with hostility. The first waves of German POWs arrived in Canada in 1940, many of them Kriegsmarine sailors whose U-boats had been sunk in the Atlantic. And these men carried with them the Reich's propaganda about what awaited captured soldiers in enemy hands. They'd been told stories of torture, starvation, and execution, fed a steady diet of lies about Allied brutality that was designed to make them fight to the death rather than surrender. Historical records from interviews conducted decades later reveal that many prisoners actually felt relief when they realized they'd survived the initial capture, believing they'd somehow gotten lucky with unusually merciful captors. What they didn't understand yet was that their experience wasn't an exception, but rather the standard of treatment that Canada had committed to under the Geneva Convention, taken seriously in ways that would have seemed impossible to men raised under Nazi ideology. When prisoners arrived at camps like the one established in Lethbridge, Alberta, or the sprawling facility at Camp 30 in Bowmanville, Ontario, they found themselves confronted with a reality that made no sense within their worldview. The camps themselves were the first shock to the system. Military records show that Canadian authorities had constructed facilities that, while certainly restricting freedom, provided conditions that many prisoners later admitted were better than what they'd experienced in the German military. Barracks were heated, luxury that seemed almost decadent to men who'd spent winters on the Eastern Front or in cramped U-boat quarters. Each prisoner received 3 meals a day, and while the food wasn't lavish, it was consistent and nutritious, meeting caloric requirements that exceeded what many German civilians were receiving back home. As the war dragged on and Allied bombing campaigns disrupted supply lines, preserved letters from POWs to their families in Germany had to be carefully worded to avoid censorship. But they contained telling phrases about adequate provisions and unexpected comforts to hint at the surprise these men felt. One prisoner, whose correspondence is preserved in the archives of Library and Archives Canada, wrote to his wife in 1943 that he'd gained weight since his capture, a statement that must have seemed surreal to recipients in increasingly desperate Germany. But the physical conditions were only the beginning of what would challenge these prisoners' understanding of their captors. Canadian authorities made a decision that was controversial even among Allied nations at the time. They would put POWs to work, but they would pay them for their labor. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs could be required to work. But Canada went beyond minimum requirements by establishing a wage system that allowed prisoners to earn money that could be spent in camp canteens or saved. This wasn't forced labor in the brutal sense that Nazi Germany employed in its concentration camps and occupied territories. Rather, it was structured employment with compensation, rest periods, and safety standards. German POWs found themselves working in lumber camps across British Columbia, on farms throughout the prairie provinces, and in various labor projects that supported Canada's war effort without directly contributing to combat operations. Historical records from the Department of Labor show that Canadian farmers, facing severe labor shortages as Canadian men enlisted to fight overseas, initially resisted the idea of German POWs working their fields. But many changed their minds after witnessing the prisoners' work ethic and desperate need for money labored the relationship between German POWs and Canadian farmers became one of the most unexpected aspects of the entire program. A prisoner named Helmut Horner, whose account was documented in academic research by historians at the University of Waterloo, described being transported with a group of fellow POWs to a farm in southern CHL, Ontario in the summer of 1944. They expected to be treated as slave labor, worked to exhaustion, and given minimal sustenance, but instead found themselves invited to eat lunch with the farming family, sitting at the same table and sharing the same food. Horner recalled his confusion when the farmer's wife asked if he wanted more potatoes, treating him as a guest rather than an enemy. This kind of interaction, repeated across thousands of farms and work sites, began to erode the ideological foundations that Nazi propaganda had built. These prisoners had been taught that Canadians, like all Allied peoples, were mongrel races corrupted by Jewish influence and democratic weakness. But here they were, face to face with families who worked hard, showed Christian charity, and treated them with a dignity that was supposed to be reserved for the Aryan master race. Sports became another unexpected avenue through which the walls between captor and captive began to break down. Canadian camp administrators recognized that idle prisoners were more likely to cause problems, maintain rigid military hierarchy, and cling to Nazi ideology. So they encouraged recreational activities that would occupy time and energy. Soccer fields were constructed within camp perimeters, and prisoners organized leagues that became intensely competitive. Boxing matches, track and field competitions, and even ice hockey games in winter months gave prisoners something to focus on beyond their captivity. But what made this truly remarkable was that Canadian guards sometimes participated in these activities, playing soccer matches against prisoner teams or teaching hockey to Germans who'd never seen the sport before. Documented accounts from camp records show that these sporting events became significant social occasions, with prisoners crafting makeshift trophies and organizing tournaments that involved multiple camps. One particularly detailed account from Camp 132 in Medicine Hat, Alberta, describes a soccer tournament in 1943 where prisoners from different German military branches, Luftwaffe, Wehrmacht, and Kriegsmarine, competed against each other with a fervor that suggested sports provided an outlet for energy, an emotion that had nowhere else to go. Music proved even more transformative than sports for many prisoners. The Canadian government allowed and even encouraged musical activity within the camps, and the results were extraordinary. Prisoners formed orchestras, jazz bands, and choir groups that performed regularly for fellow POs and occasionally for Canadian audiences. Instruments were provided through Red Cross packages and Canadian donations. And prisoners who'd been musicians in civilian life before the war found themselves able to practice their art in captivity. One of the most well-documented musical groups was the orchestra at Camp 30 in Bowmanville, which included trained musicians who performed professionally in Germany. They gave concerts that featured classical German composers like Beethoven and Bach, but also incorporated popular music of the era. Historical records indicate that some Canadian civilians actually requested permission to attend these concerts. Curious about the musical talents of men they'd been taught to hate as enemies, the psychological impact of music on prisoners cannot be overstated. For men who'd been stripped of their freedom, identity, and dignity by capture, the ability to create beauty through music offered a way to reconnect with their humanity. The camp at Angler, Ontario, positioned on the remote northern shores of Lake Superior, provides one of the most fascinating case studies in how Canadian authorities dealt with the complexities of housing. POWs, who ranged from committed Nazis to disillusioned conscripts, this particular camp was designated for prisoners considered hardened Nazis, men who maintained rigid adherence to Nazi ideology and attempted to enforce it among fellow prisoners. The decision to separate ideological extremists from other prisoners was a Canadian innovation that wasn't widely practiced in other Allied POW systems. By isolating the most committed Nazis, Canadian authorities hoped to create space for other prisoners to question the ideology they'd been fed. Documents from the camp show that this strategy had mixed results. Some hardcore Nazis remained committed to the cause even as evidence of Germany's deteriorating position mounted, while others began to experience doubt as letters from home described increasing devastation and the collapse of services they'd been told were invincible. Education programs emerged as another unexpected feature of Canadian POW camps, though they were carefully structured to avoid overt propaganda that would violate Geneva Convention provisions. Canadian authorities partnered with organizations like the YMCA to provide educational opportunities ranging from language courses to vocational training. Prisoners could study English, take correspondence courses from Canadian universities, or learn trades like carpentry and mechanics that would serve them after the war. One prisoner named Wolfgang Schmidt, whose story was documented in oral history interviews conducted in the 1980s, described taking English lessons from a Canadian teacher who volunteered at the camp near Fredericton, New Brunswick. Schmidt recalled that the teacher, an elderly woman whose own son was fighting in Europe, treated the German prisoners with a kindness he found bewildering. She brought them books, corrected their grammar with patience, and once told Schmidt that she hoped someone was showing similar kindness to her son if he'd been captured. This kind of moral clarity, the recognition that enemy soldiers were also human beings with families who loved them, ran counter to everything Schmidt had been taught about racial hierarchies and the necessity of total war. Work programs extended beyond agriculture into various industries desperate for labor. German POs worked in lumber camps throughout British Columbia and Ontario, cutting timber that would be used for construction and paper production. They worked on road construction projects, built infrastructure in remote areas, and even contributed to maintenance projects at Canadian military facilities, though always under guard and never in positions where they could access sensitive information. Payment records, preserved in the National Archives, show that prisoners earned wages, though significantly less than Canadian workers would have received for the same labor. This money could be spent at camp canteens where prisoners could purchase items like cigarettes, chocolate, writing paper, and toiletries. The existence of these canteens, stocked with goods that were increasingly scarce in wartime Germany, provided another daily reminder that Allied nations, despite being at war, maintained economic systems that could still provide consumer goods to their populations and even to enemy prisoners. The psychological journey that many prisoners underwent during their captivity in Canada can be traced through letters, diaries, and post-war interviews that historians have preserved. Men arrived as soldiers of the Third Reich, many still believing in German superiority and ultimate victory even after their capture. But daily exposure to a society that contradicted everything they'd been told began to create cracks in their ideological certainty. When prisoners received letters from home describing the destruction of German cities by Allied bombing campaigns, the food shortages that left families hungry, and the increasing desperation as the Eastern and Western fronts collapsed, they had to reconcile these reports with their treatment in Canada. They were warm, fed, paid for their work, and allowed to maintain dignity even in captivity. While their families back home suffered increasing privation and danger, this cognitive dissonance proved impossible for many to ignore. The relationship between guards and prisoners evolved in unexpected ways over the years of the war. Initially, both groups maintained rigid military protocol and emotional distance, but the simple fact of daily proximity began to break down barriers. Guards were often Canadian soldiers who had been deemed unfit for overseas combat due to age or medical conditions. Men who took their duty seriously, but weren't consumed by the same combat hatred that frontline soldiers might have felt toward Germans. Documented accounts from guard rosters and personal letters show that guards and prisoners sometimes developed cautious friendships, sharing cigarettes, discussing sports, or simply exchanging greetings that acknowledged their shared humanity. This wasn't universal. Some guards maintained hostility toward prisoners throughout the war, especially those who'd lost family members fighting in Europe. But the overall atmosphere in most Canadian camps was characterized more by pragmatic coexistence than by the brutality that characterized POW camps in other theaters of the time. War that the camp newspapers that prisoners were allowed to produce provide fascinating insights into how German POWs processed their experience. Several camps published newsletters written in German that were submitted to Canadian censors for approval before distribution. These newspapers contained camp news, sports scores, announcements about concerts or theatrical productions, and carefully worded articles